Thank you very much to the organizers of this very interesting symposium for inviting me to come to Tokyo. This is the second time I come to RIETI to talk about labor market issues. The first time was about temporary employment. This time is elderly employment. I guess that my role in this symposium is to give you some ideas of how we address this issue, the issue of aging and elderly employment in Europe. And, well, you know, European labor markets tend to be highly regulated. There are a lot of rigidities. And typically what labor economics do in Europe is to search for the effects of these rigidities, the effects of labor market institutions. So what I am going to do here is to give you some idea about how these rigidities affect differently to different types, different population groups. And among these population groups, I am going to focus particularly on elderly workers. But before doing that, I think it will be useful to give you some panoramics of how population aging and how labor markets are in Europe compared to the situation in Japan. That's going to be the first part of my presentation. The second part of the presentation is what I just told you, is to what extent labor market institutions and differences in labor market institutions can explain the differential effects on job creation and job destruction among different population groups. Okay? Labor market institution is not only about how many jobs are created and how many jobs are destroyed, it's also about what jobs are created and what type of jobs are destroyed. So that's what I'm going to use a recent paper I wrote with two colleagues at the Bank of Spain to show you how the labor market institution might have a differential impact across population groups. And then finally, if I have time, and in anticipation of the discussion that we might have in the panel, I will try to rationalize why labor market institutions are important and what are the channels by which this labor market institution may affect the employment opportunities of all the workers respect to other population groups. Okay? So that's the outline of the presentation. So let's go first to the panoramics of what is the demographic situation and labor market situation in Europe. Well, first, something which is well known. Europe is aging, as is happening in the US and Japan. In this graph, what you have is the proportion of youth population to total population. Youth population is 15 to 24. You have men, women. Well, and you already see, and this is well known, the proportion of young workers in the young people in the population is decreasing, and it has been decreasing very fast in Japan. Also, when you look at the population between 25 and 54, again, in Europe, is starting to decrease. This is 28 countries in Europe. This includes Eastern countries and Southern European countries. And it's starting to decrease, and it's decreasing very slowly because in some countries, in Southern Europe in particular, the aging is a little bit delayed with respect to the US and with respect to Japan. And of course, the counterpart of this is that the older population is rising. This is the population between 55 to 64. And what you see is, well, in Japan is where the highest ratio is the highest ratio, around 8% for men, about 8% for women, 7.5% for men. And you see here that in Japan this is starting to decrease, but only because the population over 65 years of age is skyrocketing. So there is a big increase in the population over 65 years of age. So population aging in Europe is taking place. It's taking place slowly than in Japan and with some delay, but it's happening. It's happening and it's going to continue. These are projections into the 21st century by the United Nations of how these proportions are going to evolve. And again, the youth population in Japan is continuing decreasing and is going to stabilize around 5% for men, 5% for women in the middle of the century. In the US and Europe, is going to decrease continuously through the whole century. Okay? This is the adult population from 25 to 54. The fact that population aging is taking place with some delay in Europe and in the US with respect to Japan is what explains that in Japan these ratios are going to stabilize around 2050, while in the other countries will continue decreasing. And if you look at the population over 65 years of age, then you see that in Japan it's going to be about 20% women, about 15% men. So we are talking about countries in which this population group, people over 65 years of age, are going to be roughly, in terms of ratio to the total population, are going to be more than double that we were used to be. Right? So this is a very intense and a very fast population aging that all the countries, the US, Europe, and Japan, are going to face better sooner than later. Now, labor market situation. Well, here there are also very important differences across these three areas. In Europe, we have highest unemployment, we have highest youth unemployment, and we have the lowest employment rate of older workers. Typically, in Europe, the unemployment rate, the average unemployment rate is around 8–9%. During the crisis, it went up to 11%, and now it's around that number, 10.5%. In the US, the unemployment rate went up to almost 10% during the crisis, and is now around 5%. In Japan, the unemployment rate was slightly above 5% in the worst moment of the crisis, and now is only a little bit above 3%. So we are talking about very different labor markets, and not only because the size of the unemployment rate, but also because of the distribution of this unemployment rate across population group. Youth unemployment is a very severe problem in Europe. You see it here in this graph. This is the difference between the unemployment rate of young workers, 15–24, with respect to middle-aged workers, 25 to 54. You see, in the US, these differences are typically more than 10 percentage points. in Europe. In the US, it's a little bit lower, between 6 and 8 percentage points. In Japan, it's only 2 percentage points. Okay? And the same for elderly workers. Here you have the employment rate, not the unemployment, but the employment rate of workers between 55 to 64 relative to middle-aged workers, 25 to 54, again, in the 3 areas. And well, you see this difference is lowest in Japan, only 15 percentage points. In the US, it's around 20 percentage points and converging a little bit with Japan. In Europe, we are talking about 40 percentage points of differences. And it has improved recently during the crisis, and this is something we have seen in Europe for the first time during the recent crisis, but it is still almost 30 percentage points, or more than 30 percentage points. Okay? And finally, if you look at workers, I'm going to skip this. If you look at workers over 65 years of age, you see, for men in Japan, although this employment rate has been decreasing, it's still above 25%. In Europe, basically, nobody works after 65 years of age. The employment rates are slightly 5% for men, less than about 2–3% for women. Okay? So it seems to me that aging is most intense and fastest in Japan. The unemployment rate is lowest in Japan. The employment rate of elderly workers is highest in Japan. So when talking about policies about how to address aging, it seems to me that there is more to learn for us from Japan than from you from Europe. Okay? But in any case, let me go to the second part of my presentation and tell you about how we can go at improving these policies. Before, Alessio Brown was talking about evidence-based policies. What I am going to tell you now is what kind of evidence do we have to propose changes in labor market policies to affect elderly employment. And as I told you, I'm going to do that using a recent paper I wrote with 2 colleagues at the Bank of Spain. In this paper, basically what we do is look at labor market flows during the Great Recession in different European countries and see how these labor market flows change by country and by population groups. Okay? When I talk about labor market flows, I am looking at basically job creation and job destruction. So it means how many people went from employment to unemployment, and how many people went from unemployment to employment, okay? In a period of 1 year. So these are yearly transition rates, okay? Now, in this graph, what you have is percentage points of changes in the flows from employment to unemployment for the aggregate and for different population groups. You have 18 different population groups distinguishing men, women, and then age, 15 to 29, 30 to 49, 50 to 64, and education, low level of education, medium level of education, and high level of education. Okay? So there are 19 dots in each of these lines. One of them represents the change in the flows for the total population and then for each particular population group. Okay? Well, basically what you see for instance, in this graph, you have Austria, Belgium, and Germany. These are the three countries in which, during the crisis, basically the unemployment rate didn't change, didn't increase by much. Okay? And you see that, well, for instance, in the aggregate, we are talking about, in the case of Austria, a very small increases in the flows from employment to unemployment. So we are talking about countries in which the crisis didn't have much effect on the flow, on job destruction. Okay? There are many explanations for this. Many people say that in the case of Austria and Germany, well, it was mostly about changes in working hours, what allowed to accommodate the fall in demand, and therefore there was not much job destruction needed to accommodate the crisis. Okay? Well, then if you go for the group, you can see to what extent which population groups were most affected by job destruction. And typically in a recession, what you see is that people with low skills who are mostly affected. The fact that here you don't see much outliers in these lines means that, and the fact that the scale is small, it means that, well, there is nothing particularly interesting in this graph. I mean, there was no much differences in these countries, mostly because in these countries, well, job destruction was very small. Okay? When you start looking at countries in which the unemployment rate increased, then there are some differences, right? These are Denmark, France, Sweden, and the UK. And here, basically, you see this spike here, which means that in countries like the UK and France, it were young men workers with low education, those most affected by job destruction. Okay, so in the aggregate, the increase in this flow was about 2%. For the case of this group, it was almost 6%. Okay? In the case of women, well, the group most affected was women with low education, but not the youngest one, only those in the middle age. Okay? Most interesting is the group of countries in which the unemployment rate increased significantly. These are the countries most affected by the crisis, which are Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal. In Spain, my home country, the unemployment rate was 8% at the beginning of the crisis. It went up to 25%. So what you see in this graph is that the change in the flow is now higher, and that, again, young people with low education, men and female, tend to be most affected by employment destruction. Okay? In the case of older people, you see the increase in job destruction was much lower compared to young workers. So in this recession, it was particularly, and in this group of countries, age was a very good predictor of who was losing the job. And this has to do with the kind of labor market that we have in this country, which is very segmented, with young people predominantly occupying temporary jobs or jobs with temporary employment contracts. And these were who mostly suffered from the crisis. Okay? So in the presentation, you have similar graphs for the other flow, for the flow of job creation. So how many people went from unemployment to employment? Okay, again, the same type of graph in the aggregate. Now the scale is inverted and it's negative, right? So the flows, job creation decrease significantly. So what you see is the decrease in the flows from unemployment to employment. And again, in countries like Austria, Belgium, and Germany, you don't see much differences among the different population groups. In Denmark, Sweden, and UK, you start to see that, that there are differences across population groups. And in this case, it is all workers, you see. In the case of women, women with 50 to 64, low education, medium education, high education, were finding less jobs than other population groups, okay? And in countries like Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal, again, you see significant differences across the different population groups. I mean, the more that these lines resemble a star, the more differences there are among the different population groups, okay? So, you find all these differences. What do you do with them? Well, one possibility is to do the following exercise. Remember, here we have 18 points, 18 population groups, 11 countries. So one thing that you can do is trying to explain whether these differences across countries and across population groups are related to labor market institutions. Okay? Again, remember, we are using observation only for the period 2006 and 2012. So we are looking at flows during the Great Recession. So from this, you are going to learn something about the effect of labor market institutions during the Great Recession. But as Professor Newmark said before, well, it's precisely in this recession where labor market institutions may be more binding and might have more effects on hiring and firing of different population groups. So this is good if you want to. It's precisely in great recessions, in recessions where you are mostly concerned with the effects of policies, and therefore it's there where you can learn something to improve policies. Okay. So what I am going to show you is very simple regressions. We regress the flows, the size of the flows that we have. I have showed you in the previous graphs with a bunch of labor market institutions. Okay, and I am going to report basically this coefficient, alpha 2, and I am going to see how this coefficient is different across the different population groups. Okay? Of course, I am going to condition for changes in economic activity. So the effect of institutions is controlled for the fact that the change in GDP growth was different across countries. There are also fixed effects in this regression. And basically what we wanted to see is to what extent this coefficient, which represent the effect of the institutions on job creation and job destruction, is different across population groups. Okay? So in the graphs, you have a point, and then the standard confidence band, the 95 confidence band, 95%. Okay? And in the horizontal axis, you have the 18 groups, male and female, the 3 age groups, young, middle, and old, and the 3 education groups, low, medium, and high. Okay? So in this first graph, we look at the effect of temporary contracts. So this is how easy it is to use temporary contracts in the different countries. And what this coefficient tells you is how the legislation on temporary contracts affects job destruction. Okay? In these other graphs, we have permanent contracts. And in this case, it's the other way around. This is a strict net of permanent contracts. This is how a very strict employment protection legislation for permanent contract makes more or less difficult to destroy employment. Okay? Basically, what you see is that if employment protection legislation is very, very restrictive, very stringent, then there is less job destruction. Okay? And there is less job destruction. And this is particularly more clear for some population groups around here. These are women. Than for typically young workers are less protected than old workers when you look at these coefficients. Okay? And in the case of temporary contracts, what you see is that temporary contracts makes easier to dismiss young workers than to dismiss old workers, which is this group here and this group here. Okay? I admit the differences are not that large, and sometimes the coefficients are not significant, but still, this gives you an idea of how different labor market institutions across European countries might be affecting job creation and job destruction of different population groups. Of course, these are very simple regressions. There is one regression for each group, so we are not taking into account the possibility of interaction among the different groups. Okay? And of course, you might argue, as it always happens in this kind of studies, in this literature, that, well, changes of institutions are not exogenous, institutions are not exogenous, that there is an endogeneity problem in this regression. But in any case, I think that it provides some idea of what is the effect of employment protection legislation on job destruction of different population groups. Okay? In the slides, you have the same kind of regressions for unemployment benefits. This is how unemployment benefits affect job destruction of the different groups. Okay? Expenditure in active labor market policies. Wage setting. Wage setting is represented here by union density. Union density, the proportion of workers affiliated to unions, the level at which collective bargaining takes place, and coordination of collective bargaining. And again, the same kind of things for flows from unemployment to employment. Same kind of flows for job creation. Who gets the jobs, which groups get the job, depending on the institutions. Okay? I don't have time to discuss in detail any one of these graphs. You have the graphs in the slides. You can look at them. And then if you have questions in the panel, we can address those questions. Okay? What I wanted to do instead is that once that there is some evidence there, and I'm giving you some indication of what is going on, is to discuss why these institutions could be relevant for the issue of how to promote elderly employment. What are the transmission channels by which policies might be creating these differences in employment to unemployment flows and unemployment to employment flows of the different population groups. Okay? So let's start with the flows from employment to no employment, to unemployment and inactivity. Why employment policies and labor market policies in general might make these flows particularly intense from some population groups, and in particular for older workers? What are the mechanisms why older workers are more likely to be dismissed depending on the institutional configuration of the labor market? Well, the first has to do with the relationship between wages and productivity. In most labor markets, and in most, particularly when there is collective bargaining, it used to be the case that there are seniority-based pay systems. And this was very common in the past. In my home country, every collective bargaining agreement had a provision for increasing wages with seniority. But most importantly is the fact that employment protection legislation also protect more people with more seniority, because typically severance pay increase with seniority. So this means that the bargaining power of older workers is typically higher than the bargaining power of young workers. So for those two reasons, you see that wages tend to increase with seniority. It's true that in many countries, in Europe too, I was told that this is happening in Japan, this wage profile is now becoming flatter because seniority-based pay systems are being gradually dismantled, and because employment protection legislation has been somehow smooth in Europe. Okay? But still you see wages increasing with age. Well, given that it is a fact of life that productivity declines with age, well, there are many studies documenting to what extent this is a physiological fact, or to what extent there might be negative externalities of when productivity is declining with age. Then it means that when firms consider dismissing workers, the imbalance between wage and productivity is typically higher for older workers. So workers, firms always are going to prefer to dismiss older workers than young workers. Typically also because the relationship between wage and productivity for young workers is more favorable to the firm, to the fact that wages are front-loaded, wages at the beginning of the career are lower than productivity. It means that there is, for firms in need of adjusting the labor force, it's going to be preferable to dismiss older workers. The only reason why they don't do that is because employment protection legislation. So now you see why employment protection legislation is important to understand the difference of different population groups when addressing job destruction. Okay? So, and this in Europe is a big problem. Because, of course, you don't want to reduce employment protection legislation for all the workers. Somehow you want to keep some mechanism by which all the workers get the investment they made during the whole career in a particular firm. But on the other hand, by protecting older workers, you are making that the firms dismiss young workers. And in particular, this happens in countries like Spain, my home country, in which young workers are on temporary contracts, and therefore it's much cheaper for the firm to dismiss young workers. So is this good or bad from a social point of view? Should you protect old workers or young workers? Well, it's a difficult choice. In the case of the current situation and in the case of Spain, I think we have a big problem with youth unemployment. There is evidence that the scarring effect of unemployment is higher for young workers. So these are workers who now have a high educational attainment. So not giving job opportunities to these young workers is a big problem. So there are things that you might consider, and there in red I put some things that could be for policy discussion, how to make employment protection legislation more neutral across different population groups, try to avoid firing costs depending on seniority, think about protecting workers and not jobs, thinking about other instruments than severance pay to protect workers. And that has to do with unemployment benefits and how you finance unemployment benefits. So basically what you want is that when the firm is dismissing a worker, the firms internalize the social cost of that dismissals. And there are several ways of doing that. One is like the system they use in the US with experience rating unemployment benefits, which in Europe is not prevalent at all, and I think that in Japan you don't have it either. Okay. Well, this has to do another thing that might be important for this decision to dismiss workers is stigma effects, and to what extent is more socially accepted to dismiss old workers than young workers. Here there are two things. One is that in Europe, it used to be the case that dismissing old workers was not much of a problem, because in Europe there were many schemes by which dismissed old workers can get into retirement benefits. So in previous recessions, dismissing old workers was the way of adjusting to the fall in labor demand. And the way that the European way of adjusting to crisis in the past was dismissing old workers rather than young workers. Of course, you can do that if you have a sound, sustainable pension system. But if population is aging and your pension system is not sustainable, then dismissing old workers is very costly. Okay? So what is happening during this recession is that since these schemes are not available anymore, and retirement age is being increased in most countries, the way of adjusting, particularly in the countries in which the labor market was segmented with a lot of temporary employment and so on, the way of adjusting has been reducing youth employment. Okay. But In any case, I think it's important to fight against this idea, the lamp of labor fallacy, that this is a zero-sum game, that by restricting the supply of older workers, you are going to increase the employment opportunity of younger workers. This is theoretically unsound, and there is no empirical evidence whatsoever. It's true that during a recession, there should be some margin of substitutions that you can exploit, but in the long run, this is not the way of addressing the issue. So any idea of labor market policy inspired by the lamp of labor fallacy, I think, is a very bad starting point to discuss employment policies. And finally, of course, if there is age discrimination or there are stereotypes against particular groups, of course, this is going to affect which workers are going to be dismissed. Professor Niemeyer already talked about this. I think this is more relevant for the other flow, for the flow from unemployment to employment. But in any case, discrimination laws are also important in this regard. And by the way, I was a little bit amused by the conversation we have before when some colleagues, some Japanese colleagues, were explaining to me the Japanese system, the Japanese pension system. It seems to me that mandatory retirement at 60 is very discriminatory. I mean, there is no better way of discriminating against older workers than by mandating retirement at 60. Okay? I know you have reasons to have that rule, but it's discriminatory. Again, now, finally, in the last 3 minutes I have, job creation. Who is going to be hired and how labor market institution affects these hires? Of course, in this case, older workers are in a very bad situation. And I am not surprised by the evidence that Professor Niemeyer presented before about who got callback rate in the experiment he was running. Because, of course, when you think about hiring old workers, the balance between the wage you expect to pay them from now to the future, to the end of the employment relationship, and productivity that you expect from that worker from now to the end of the employment relationship is going to be not that appealing as the balance between wage and productivity of young workers. Okay? So the fact that skills are different for different workers, that the composition of the skill are different, and that the incentive to invest in this skill are also different, make older workers less attractive to firms. And again, I think this is a fact of life. There is nothing, this has to do with the fact that the employment relationship that you expect with older workers is shorter when you are considering hiring older workers. But of course, there are many dimensions of skills. There is general human capital, there is a specific human capital. So I think that for some particular skills, older workers could be appealing, and in particular for transferring a specific human capital to younger cohorts, older workers are very, very useful. I mean, there is no better way of transferring a specific human capital than by combining older workers with young workers. There is also the issue of generosity of benefit system, another reason why older workers might have higher reservation wages. In some cases, going to work for these workers imply losing pension benefits or unemployment benefits, so the reservation wages of older workers are high. and this implies that they are going to work only if the wage is higher. The way to address this is probably combining retirement benefits with part-time employment. There is the issue of to what extent older workers and younger workers are substitute. As I said, in the case of a specific human capital, I think that they are not substitute, but rather complementary. And as I anticipated before, to what extent there are age discrimination laws is very, very important, but Professor Newman already talked about this, so I am not going to say anything else. So I will conclude. I think that this is a very important issue. In Europe, during the last crisis, we have seen a better performance of elderly employment than in previous recession, but this is not enough. It's not enough in Europe, and probably even in Japan, given population aging, you need higher employment rates of older workers for maintaining economic growth, for sustaining the welfare state. So, thinking about which and how labor market policies need to be reformed to make this possible, I think is a very important topic and should be very, very, very high in the policy agenda. So thank you very much.